for keeping in the room. I know there's a lot of people outside, and I'm conscious that perhaps standards doesn't excite a terrific audience. But it's very important for those people like myself who are involved in proselytizing public-private and actually trying to get implementation. And given all the problems and debates there are about whether standards are even possible, this is for us a very, very critical issue, and your input is, into this discussion is very, very, very welcomed. The issue also, of course, is time. So we have to, because we want a coffee break, I certainly do, and I know you do, the panel does, so we'll keep this to about 40 minutes if we can. I want, if I may, first of all, to make a small introduction regarding standards. The UNECE has been working in this area now for three and a half years. The idea behind it was that, first of all, we saw countries who had been successful in delivery of public-private partnerships tended to be those whose countries actually had a more standardized process of delivering projects. The United Kingdom is the main example of this. And that flashed us in our mind. Here's public-private. It's going to be the flavor of the month for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. How do we mainstream it? Is there a way of dealing with complicated systems, putting it in packages that could actually be digestible by governments? And taking the analogy a little bit forward about eating a little bit forward, we wanted to put them in an attractive, consistent style. And also identify some which is now considered a lacuna within the international community, and was mentioned by UNDESA, our colleagues, Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York, that within the literature there existed a lack of actual data on the performance of public-private partnerships in specific sectors, such as water sanitation, such as renewable energy, such as, and so on. That there was sort of general conceptualization of PPP, but not actual sectoral issues, and a need for those sectoral studies to be done and made available. And of course the demand. Within the UN system now, we're seeing a kind of dysfunctional debate taking place on public-private. And I don't mean to be critical of the UN because I'm part of it, but I was in New York 2 weeks ago where PPP was being talked about, and I was sitting on a podium like this, and there were three levels of the discussion. There was PPP at the level of infrastructure and project finance and risk allocation, the model that we're talking about here. There was PPP about UN joining with private companies on delivering programs of assistance to developing countries, where it was kind of like the UN instigating and getting sort of resources from a private company for delivery. And then there was another model where everyone was involved, civil society organizations, governments, in a kind of multi-stakeholder capability. Now, that level of dysfunction, in a sense, because no one can actually write something common for those three types of, in fact, the UN has guidelines on how business should be run within the UN and its relationships. But we can't deal with those three levels. We need at least some clear definition and exclude actually those things which don't belong to that category. PPP are quite specific in terms of performance requirements and in terms of the large mobilization of capital that they require. These other ones are not quite in those sorts of terms, although they're extremely important for the SDGs. Let me go through some questions. So that's where we come from the UN. We're doing standards. We have a number of project teams looking at standards in renewable energy. We work also with a French specialist centre of excellence on law policy and institutions, looking at common contractual provisions, framework legal, the sort of macro and the micro of actually doing PPP. We have, of course, the zero tolerance to corruption, also in cooperation with the French Centre of Excellence in Law Policy and Institutions. So we've got around about 18 standards, and we've got probably in the pipeline others coming through. So this session is very important for us. So rather than me going on, let me introduce, first of all, Art Smith. Art, could you give us a couple of minutes, just a couple, I'm afraid, on how you see standards in your practice and how you feel they could really be helpful for governments? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Jeffrey, I'd like to note that the UNECE process for generating the PPP standards is a unique one in that it is a process that's led by the member nations. The governments that participate in the process development effort govern throughout the entire life cycle of the standard process. We have a bureau at the UNECE team of specialists on PPPs, which consists of representatives from 10 countries who are elected by the member nations, and it is by an agreement of the Bureau, a consensus approach, that the subjects for PPP standards are generated. So a standard is begun when the member nations have identified that there's a need and an interest in a standard on this topic. The Bureau then oversees the development of a project team, which includes members of the public sector, members of the private sector, and representatives of NGOs to provide a broad variety of stakeholder input. The development of the standard is monitored by the government representatives on the Bureau, and then there's a public comment process in which the standards are published for broad public comment. And then finally, the member countries look at the standard which is proposed for adoption and determine whether it meets the need. And then by a vote or election of the member nations, the process is adopted as an official UNECE standard.
Thanks very much. Raymond, you're with us and representing sometimes civil society, but very erudite in whatever you say. I suppose the question is such a thing as standards really possible, given the absolute heterogeneity almost of each project, from one country to another? What's your view on that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you, Jeffrey, as well as your team, for being ahead of the whole SDGs. As you mentioned, you already started before we had our
that caused problems, so it was too quick.
Oh, no, but it is true. So you already started with the process of trying to help the PPPs with standards to find common ground and to make it a more rational, also transparent approach. So I want to acknowledge that. And as a way to respond to your question, to the audience, who probably most of you maybe have heard a little bit about SDGs, but you don't necessarily know the details of it, just two citations. The SDGs have been agreed by all of the 193 member countries to the United Nations. They have agreed to specific goals, the so-called 17 goals, plus for each goal targets, and for each target indicators to measure whether the country has achieved these targets or not. So it's beyond now just talking and talking, it's becoming very specific. And for the topic here that we are focusing on, public-private partnerships, I'd just like to draw your attention to two. 17.16, 17 is about financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And 17.16, which is a target, says enhance the global partnerships for sustainable development, complemented by multi-stakeholder partnerships, right? Not no business as usual, private, public, banking, and the operators who construct, for instance, physical infrastructure projects. It's beyond that traditional PPP understanding of PPPs. And so it's these multi-stakeholder partnerships that mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology, and financial resources to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in all countries, in particular in developing countries. In this short text stands sharing information, helping each other, learning from each other. So the points I made in the previous panel, it's right here in the text. And 17.17, which I very much want to pursue in more detail through the work that we do at our center, it says, encourage and promote effective public, public-private, and civil society partnerships. So it's no longer just public-private. It's an acknowledgement that in many of our countries, for instance, cooperatives are very important economic actors with a social integrative function. So it is beyond public-private old style, and through building on experience and resourcing strategies of partnerships. So here is an invitation to learn from each other and to broaden the involvement. You know, let's not forget, SDGs are supposed to be based on partnership, inclusiveness, and transparency. So all PPPs, if they're put into the SDG context, are supposed to benefit beyond just the constructor and those who finance a project. It's this inclusiveness, I think it would be worth to further discuss, because that's what you have in the title, People First PPPs.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Xingrong Yu, who is Jani to us, Jani, you worked in the private sector before you joined us in the UNECE Secretariat in Geneva, so that's very unique. And you also were working in Switzerland in the private sector. I can't resist asking you the question. The Chinese companies, the companies that you were sort of bringing in touch with Swiss companies to work together, how do you think standards could really play a part for Chinese companies? Is it important that they take standards forward?
Yes, good afternoon. So as Jeffrey, my chef, said, in my previous business, I'm providing matchmaking services to bring Chinese companies and Swiss companies working together, especially in the technology side. During my work, I realized there are some difficulties between both sides to understand each other, not only because of language is different, but also because from different background, different knowledge level. But there was a common language is the standards. And for example, in environmental sector, there was a standards called the EU 2000. And there are standards for developed by a German standards company, TÜV. And these standards are commonly used in China and the world very well. But some area there was no standards, then brings a lot of difficult, spend a lot of time to communicate. So my personally convinced to help to avoid misunderstanding, especially on our work in PPP, we wanted to ensure the performance towards the UN SDGs, and we should have the standards. And China currently is really supporting this standards development initiative as well. For example, the company CIECC and the project leader, Mr. Kai-Meng Li, he is now leading the Urban Rail project team to develop these PPP standards. And he is working together with international experts and not only contribute China experience and also discuss together connecting global cases and to develop very good standards in the future.
Well, that's fascinating, and there's one or two other questions that this raised too. I wanted just to ask Wayne. Now, Wayne, you are a very distinguished professor here at City University. I don't know why and I've heard you speak and I very much enjoy it. I think you what I would call a little bit skeptical about standards. So maybe that's not a nice introduction for you, but what do you take by the word skepticism? Do you think this is a useful tool?
Thank you, Jeffrey. Philosophically, I think, something about standards, the need for standards derives from some sort of failure in the market. You can think of standards as regulations, essentially. So it has to be a public good. Support is provided by government.
Yes.
So the standards, if problems, addressed by standards can be solved by contracting, we will not have the need to have standards. For example, environmental protection being one of the standards.
Right.
So, but contracting sometimes ignores that because of the pursuit.
Yeah.
So I think there's need for standards if there's market failure. And indeed, in PPP projects, having PPP itself is sort of recognition of some sort of market failure.
Yeah.
So in order to provide their service, some regulations or some standards must be in place.
Yes.
So I think
Yes.
I'm kind of supportive of that, but as to what kind of standards, that's subject to debate. Now, the other thing, I guess, the other aspect of standards are really standardization. And to me, that's probably more essential, more useful. For example, in documentations,
Yeah.
as you mentioned,
Yes.
having standardization in legal documentations certainly would be very useful, no matter which country you go to.
Yeah.
Instead of that, and in procurement, the processes, the bidding process, everything involving documentation.
Yeah. Well,
I think I can be
no,
standardized.
I think that's good, and that hits
Yeah.
on the point why we want standards. We want to scale up public-private. We don't want to do 10, 100,000. We want to do tens of thousands, because that's what the Sustainable Development Goals has targeted and challenged us. And if we do every project, hire the lawyer, give us the documents, reinvent the wheel each time, we'll be here until the end of the world before we make any progress. And I hate to say this, I don't think we have a lawyer on the group here, and I wonder if there are lawyers in the audience. I know one, but are there any lawyers in the audience? Would they put their hands up?
Some of the,
Some of them rather sheepishly putting their hands up there. Well, let me be honest, PPP was actually quite lucrative for lawyers. And I wonder to what extent they appreciate actually this standardization, if they see this might even be a little bit of a threat to their income. I don't want to be in any way disparaging, because I know we have many lawyers actually in our project teams making standards. But let's just leave that for the moment. I wanted to raise one question, and it was actually Chris Heathcote in one of the panels previously, who I thought did a tremendous job of summing up what a transformative process was going to be like using public-private partnerships. Not just roads, but putting roads through and creating something, creating value added in the society. And I think it's, again, one of the UN bosses that I had who said to me, Jeffrey, you know a little bit about public-private, but for heaven's sake, give me a case study which I can actually use to communicate properly with people. So that put me on my mettle. We need to get, I think, cases, models, transformative things, projects, which can actually communicate. In your experiences, what are the projects that could be the basis for standards that have made, in your view, such an impression? Art, I have to ask you to deal with that difficult question.
Well, I think that when we talk about PPPs with transformative outcomes, that's what we're looking for when we accomplish PPPs in the first place. We don't do them solely for the purpose of completing a PPP. And so in selecting the projects, there should be a focus on the outcomes, and we should prioritize the projects along that end. But just as an example of how PPPs can support economic development and transformative goals, we could look at the N4 toll road in South Africa. This is a 440-kilometer road which runs from Witbank, South Africa to the port of Maputo on the Indian Ocean in Mozambique. And this was a case where Mozambique wanted to develop, it had a deep water port on the Indian Ocean, which was not fully achieving its economic potential because the surface transportation assets leading up to the road were not adequate. So they wanted to improve the roads and the rail leading to the port. South Africa then was desiring access to an Indian Ocean port and began talking to Mozambique about how they could extend the road from the border to Witbank in central South Africa. And the result was the two countries working together on a 440-kilometer road which linked the two countries and created economic development and export increases within both countries. That is a transformative result.
I should have also added that we're not just looking for the good cases, we also have to recognize that people can learn and develop standards on bad cases. In fact, it's sometimes on the bad cases that the lessons can be particularly drawn. Are there any bad projects that you think in your experience that really could be used in illustrative purposes such as we have in mind? Yes, Wei, what would you say?
Something came to my mind when you said there's some bad experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, Hong Kong, as you know, have a lot of successful PPP projects, but one of them isn't so. The West Harbour Tunnel, for example, so far has been dismal. And initially it was, justified because the increased traffic, projected increased traffic for industrial use. Because the cross tunnel, the central cross tunnel was enough for
Yes, I remember, I know.
regular
Yes,
trafficking.
Yes, yes.
But for industry use, they thought there's a need for the West Harbour Tunnel. But after the tunnel was built, the industrial bases moved. And the cost of West Harbour Tunnel is 27 times higher than the Cross Harbour Tunnel. However, people are only willing to pay the same amount of money for crossing the harbor. They don't care how much you paid for constructing that particular tunnel. So there you go. The pricing is by the market, but your cost is 27 times higher. So how can you recover? So they jack up the fare. The higher the fare goes, the lower the traffic. So it goes to that spiral. And to this day, I think the West Harbour Tunnel has not been able to find a way out. Maybe the government has to step in, maybe to buy out, but that would be very unlikely in Hong Kong. A contract is a contract. So now, everything I guess was done properly, really, but then unexpected changes.
And
like that.
I suppose that's a very good case. I suppose also we're looking at a kind of soft policy, not just the project. The way people were treated in the project's very important, whether they were their livelihoods, local livelihoods enhanced, or even when the opponents to this particular project in a very highly visible project even got some punishment by local authorities for the stance that they took. That clearly would be seen as something that would need a standard in order to avoid any repetition of this kind. Raymond, have you any thoughts about that?
Well, the example I would like to now mention has been mentioned in the morning. It's this famous airport that was supposed to be built near Madrid and turned out to be a complete failure. Partially, I would think, or maybe not partially, mostly because the homework of planning, of assessing the market, was not done well. So it was just pushed through. And at the end, now it discredits the local authorities who are involved in it, but it discredits PPP's reputation in general.
Yeah.
Because people who don't know what went wrong think it is as such not a good idea. So I think in that sense we really should have in the standard, and as far as I know from the standard, you have steps of suggesting to the authorities to carefully plan, to do their homework. While that is, of course, good, we should have, I heard from Scott mentioning some checklist or some form of follow-on or strengthening suggestions made in the standard to check, maybe by third parties, whether these steps have actually been done or not. Otherwise, it could be nice, well-intentioned, but neglected.
Well, we're aware of some of our government's time resource, so we put the guidelines in actually checklists so governments can quickly tick boxes and then they can get in a picture of whether they've done this. Because the government official, you were at the session, said, look, a lot of governments are just going to throw it into the basket and not read it if it's too long. Anyway, Gianni, you were with me in Shenzhen where we saw that magnificent project done by Shenzhen Metro in Addis Ababa. Can you explain a little bit just why that project was so interesting and exciting, particularly the way it treated local employees?
Yes, last year, December, our team with Jeffrey visited Shenzhen and had a meeting with Shenzhen Metro. And the Shenzhen Metro present us a very good project. At least Jeffrey, representing you, I think this is a very good people first PPP project is in Ethiopia at Addis Ababa Metro. And the beautiful of these projects is Shenzhen Metro, the company, developed a beautiful, very completely training book to provide to the local African citizens to be able operating these projects after they're developed. And this give them knowledge and give them sustainability for the local country, for the people, and able to operate in these projects, and probably in the future they could also to start the second or the third projects in the future. So this is very, very good, and it's also we are promoting people first PPP in one of the 5 criteria.
Yes, certainly. I, like you, I was very impressed with Shenzhen Metro because the way it paid, actually out of its own budget, the training of people, the drivers, the ticket officers, everyone involved in that facility was trained rigorously so that when the Chinese leave the project, there will be people to take it over and it will be it's sustainable. And they lost money, and that is another thing, because I think private sector are going to have to take on a lot more training challenges in the future if these SDGs are to be achieved, and that costs something. Anyway, I think we should go through. Somebody once said, and I think it might have been Karl Marx, but let me maybe. I think the challenge is not to interpret the world, the challenge is to transform it. Might have also been Lenin, but what I'm trying to say here is that the Sustainable Development Goals is not a static thing. Every year, on a regular level, governments who've made these commitments are going to be challenged with indicators to see to what extent they put these things into they've achieved these, these particular goals. So what we've got in the standard making process is groups of people coming together. And you mentioned Kai Moon in the light rail project, another very important sector. And I think the idea is to try and get the people involved in these project teams to become their champions. And I wondered if that's a feasible concept, that the actual project teams consisting of public and private sector could sort of meet in their teams, the private sector perhaps with a little bit more knowledge than the public sector, but the public sector could thereafter be their clients for the projects to be rolled out. Again, apropos of what we just said, the world isn't just to be interpreted, we really have to transform it. Would anyone think that was a good idea? And if it was, how we might really take that forward, particularly with good private companies willing to be those champions? Wayne, you're nodding your head. That's nice to hear. You're losing your skepticism.
Yeah, I'm being won over by you. I think in order for the standards to be weighty, to be taken seriously, you gotta use them in the decision-making process.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, they're letters.
Yeah.
So I thought one way to make sure the standards are really used would be, say, to rank projects based on whether or not the standard is met, and to what degree the standard is met. But again, that can be a dynamic process. So if the public and private sector can come to some sort of agreement as to what standards are important, and we have to attach weighting to each of the standards. And then we have a score. So that's one way to champion these standards. Then I guess it would be, as I said, if it's used in the decision-making process, then I see some, potential success. Yeah.
Anyone else? You were actually referring to some project. Pedro Neves is with us, I believe, who he is pioneering, and James Stewart, whose idea it originally is, to have an evaluation methodology of the extent to which infrastructure and PPPs are consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And later today you will be distributed some guiding principles, which is the beginning of what the UN is trying to do, which is to show public-private partnerships some guidelines for the UN system as a whole, where we actually try and develop the 5 criteria that can be used for this evaluation. And my gosh, it's not easy, this scoring mechanism. But I agree with you. I think it gives an incentive of companies and governments, even with projects which have already started, to try and adjust their project to make it more consistent with sustainable development, more engagement with stakeholders, more projects that are more accessible to people who can't pay for the services. Art, sorry, would you?
I think that Wayne's on the right track here, and I think that it would not be difficult to establish that linkage for an evaluative purpose. As you think of the reasons why we do PPPs, because we want to improve market access for so many thousand people in a certain area, because we want to provide more high-quality drinking water, because we want to provide power or access to medical facilities, or economic development, which will alleviate poverty. All of these outcomes, which are the kinds of objectives that we typically have in PPP projects, relate directly to the Sustainable Development Goals. So devising a system by which we assess the degree of impact that a given project would have on the SDGs and incorporated that within the prioritization process that governments use, that the MDBs and other donors use, would I think be a very achievable thing to attempt.
Well, please, if anyone is interested in this, joining us with this evaluation methodology, it's the big thing. I mean, the thing is, it's only us that is, well, our sort of pioneering work here, but we know that this is something that the UN system desperately needs. There's too much pontification on public-private. We need to move forward, because this is a time-determinate program, 2030. It's not too far away. It seems very far away, but it's actually not. So please, yes, sorry, Raymond, please.
Come in. I think there's a misnomer in the term public-private partnership. Public, up to now, is mostly government. It's not the public at large. The SDGs are very clear. Civil society should be part of it. Finish with the maybe best and well-intentioned decisions by bankers and construction company and some government officials. It has to be, for it to be sustainable, it has to be multi-stakeholder. And I think the best way to keep everybody on their toes is to have some form of an ongoing checking, evaluating for maybe by institutions which are multi-stakeholder, something other than the traditional parties involved in public-private partnerships. That's my main message. And in that sense, the text says it, that we should broaden the stakeholdership, and for standards, which is a great first step to help get everybody on board with a similar language, understanding, and then the implementation, that's the crux of the difficulty. The text could be great, and the implementation fails. For that not to fail, we need some form of support, an institutional support, for the benefit of everybody involved. And if we talk about, the One Belt, One Road projects, of course, China is in the driving seat and will provide know-how and money. Going into countries with very different political structures, very different also culture. So the question of how to get them on the board and at the same level, standards will help, but they will need to be interpreted. Mm-hmm. There will be a need to continuously follow this in order to make it sustainable. Otherwise, it could end up with a bridge into the Gobi Desert. I mean, it's a bit extreme to put it that way, but we need to go beyond a solution that looks for utilization. And some of the PPPs maybe are a nice combination of the money, and we've got plenty of money since 2008, since the financial crisis. We all know a lot of money is chasing around for good projects. So the likelihood of things going wrong is very high. And we should support that by having the standards that UNECE is developing and add to it instruments to then implement them as intended.
Well, look, I can see my clock, or this clock, suddenly it's got green coming out of it, which it now tells me I've got about 11 minutes. I would like, first of all, any questions? Are there people interested in this subject enough who would like to raise a question to the panel? I don't see one. It's always a complicated subject. And
there's a question over there.
Sorry, I didn't see. Please, Andrew, this is Andrew Kinloch. If we could give him a microphone, that would be absolutely splendid.
Thank you. Can I go back to Professor Yu's example of the Western Harbour crossing here in Hong Kong? Had the private sector investors realised that the traffic was going to be what it turned out to be, they would clearly not have ever gone ahead with the PPP. The government, on the other hand, may have decided that the tunnel was worth building anyway, and we would just never know the economics of the project because the government doesn't disclose those, which is fine. So my question is, do the standards address when should a project be financed through PPP and when should it be financed through other means, whether that is government sovereign spending or an SOE or whatever? But one of the crucial questions with the PPP is, should we be using PPP on a project in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can immediately ask, that is the work now in progress. We have been told that one of the big lacuna in guides is simply the lack of data on particular sectors. Are some sectors appropriate for PPP and others less so? There's a kind of working assumption that in where revenue streams are being generated, particularly in transport or maybe in energy, these might be good, but in other ones like, say, health or water, they might be not so appropriate for public-private. But we have received that information externally. We wanted to work around that hypothesis to see whether that was valid or not. And that's actually in the guiding principles. And if you would like to do some homework reading, the document is going to be circulated and you will be able to see that and then come, we hope, tomorrow and make comments when these guidelines will be discussed. The identification of the suitability project, which gets into some technical detail, is more, I think Chris Heathcote has got some ideas on that. Art, would you like to respond?
Yes, I wanted to respond just in a little more detail to part of Andrew's question. And yeah, in addition to the fact that PPPs are more easily implemented within some sectors than others, the challenges, the financial profiles, the risks are different. There are differences project to project within a sector. Some road projects are appropriate candidates for PPP, others are not. And clearly that has to be part of the government's decision process. And so we recognize in the standard development process that the government should look at its objectives, the business case for a particular project, and then make a determination as to whether PPP is the way to go. And the way that we've discussed approaching that within the standards is to have one standard which is kind of a broad cross-sectoral layout of the principles, including that as part of the initial feasibility analysis, and then go into more sector-specific standards that would cover details of healthcare projects, PPP healthcare policy, roads, airports, and so on. But there are certain principles that apply across all of the sectors, and we do intend to address those.
One thing, just before I maybe ask people to come up with some questions, or maybe even some suggestions for areas that they feel might be worth putting into a standard. We have very much the project teams in mind. We have good participation from private sector and public sector, but we actually realized we had made a mistake when we offered the standard to a particular private company, because then we were sort of putting ourselves in the unenviable situation of having a standard being led by a private company who could then use that standard as a kind of commercial thing for subsequent business. And of course, we also have within the United Nations system, quite rightly, extreme spotlight by civil society organizations who are very skeptical, much more than we, are very skeptical of public-private partnerships and even want to roll back Sustainable Development Goal number 17, which, as Raymond says, is nuanced, but does include public-private as a preferred vehicle, as one of the preferred vehicles for implementation. Please, any other comments? Wait, I'm sorry.
I just want to be more skeptical.
Yeah,
because I think you made a point, that you cannot give this job to the private sector.
Yeah.
Because I said earlier, it's supposed to be public good. It's supposed to be provided by the government. Yeah. But unfortunately, I mean, this situation you observe now doesn't just apply to PPP. It applies to pretty much every other governmental services. Tax, for example. You look at the tax authorities today. Where do they come from? They come from the big accounting firms. So I guess the transfer of knowledge, because we tend to think the private sector has more knowledge, they know what's going on better, so we hire them. But then they bring the practices in to justify their own benefits in many ways. So this sort of stuff probably is not easy to avoid, even in PPPs.
Yeah, well, we have in the UN a system whereby every step of the way is controlled by the governments. The governments approve each stage. In fact, I think there are 7 stages, Art, and even the final stage the governments approve. So we've tried to be as absolutely transparent about this process, but clearly you're getting, say, a big water company to be critical. Everything in PPP has to be criticized. You just can't go on believing that everything, and it was difficult for that company to somehow put itself in a critical camp. So we said, no, let's try, and so what we're trying to do now is encourage academics, people who are not in a special purpose vehicle in private company who could operate under a conflict of interest. But as they say, you learn by your mistakes. Anyone else would like to make a question? Yes. Please.
First of all,
Yes, Chris, please.
I think it's absolutely right. You need to find a way to operationalise standards. I was wondering whether you had considered that most magnificent of operational tools, the MDBs, as a route to getting your standards to stick.
Well, we have got good cooperation with the multilateral development banks. We use them, particularly the World Bank. Well, I say only the World Bank because a lot of knowledge there, and they can give us peer reviews, and they've taken that cooperation very, very seriously, and we're extremely happy, and that really does keep us on our toes. So that's absolutely invaluable. I'm also interested even to think of development of that cooperation. Could we maybe sort of help a little bit with the upstream in a project and then sort of pass the baton to the multilateral development banks to actually do the implementation downstream? We have to, I think, a bit more, Chris, and we're very happy to think a bit more with you on how we make our standards a little bit more effective, a little bit more quick, because I am appalled how long that standard on ZTC took. I just can't believe it took 2.5 years, but that's what happens. We must make sure that we accelerate this process now, or I'll be out of a job definitely, because my boss has been telling me that all the time. But a good point.
It's a question in the back.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't see.
It's difficult to see.
I'm Li Jia, Senator Yu, and from
Yes,
Center
please.
for Socio-Economic Development. Just a very quick comment, because it's going to be a very long-winded comment, but we don't have the time. But what I would like to ask is, summing through the standards, I was struck by the fact that, it's a lot of input-oriented requirements or suggestions or recommendations. But the challenge, I think, it is for the PPP, especially people-centered PPPs in the context of SDGs, is actually in the implementation and also in the measurement of the end side. We do not really know how, one thing is we do not really know how does different projects impacting a larger sort of ecosystem in that context. And I think we need to start thinking a little bit more about the execution side and the potential outcome of this project. This is my first comment. And my second comment is I think what we have done is looking at these standards, we premise on certain assumptions about institution capabilities. And it's not very obviously articulated in the standards because we're treating the 193 because SDGs is not only targeted for developing countries, it's also for developed countries. If I take USA, for example, if they're going to upgrade their infrastructure, most of the finance probably will go to the USA rather than going to somewhere else. I think we need to start thinking very seriously about throughput in the sense of what kind of institutional capability will be necessary in order to address Andrew's question, whether the choice of PPP is really sufficient. The pressure is on for PPP. As we know that the Addis Ababa action agenda is all about PPP as a main frame of major source of the resource mobilization. I'm sorry, I'm chewing on a candy. That's why I'm started to stumbling over.
No, please. I'd like one of the candies myself after we're finished. Please give me one.
Yeah.
But
so I think we also should need to start thinking about how what exactly we're premising our standards on, and therefore we will tell the governments of different level of institutional strengths what would be the threshold would be necessary. This is my second comment. And my third comment is really to say that we need to have, just very quickly, the 1719 and 1718 is talking about data. Today we are relying on the private sector data. And because they have more data, they can make more scientific argument, and therefore they can have a consistency in that thing. And we don't have data from the public side as much. Okay,
Well,
thank you
well,
very much.
well, Madam, you've now had the last word because the time is now up. But thank you. These are three very pertinent comments, and I'm sure we can discuss them. At least I think we ought to discuss them in the next sessions. Well, it only leaves me to now thank the four panelists. It's been a short but I think very sweet discussion, and I think they deserve a round of applause, and then we can all now adjourn for coffee. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, just bear with me for one more second. I just have a couple of announcements to make. Firstly, for the parallel sessions that will follow after the coffee break, the One Belt, One Road session will happen right here. Then the other parallel stream on women's empowerment will happen on the 6th floor, so they have to go up one floor. At around just a few minutes before 5, myself and a few other student helpers will be just around the stairs to lead you to the exact venue. Then just a couple of announcements on the banquet tonight. There'll be a barbecue dinner that will start at 6:30, so that's basically directly after the parallel streams, and it's on the 19th floor of this very building. So all you need to do is go to the elevator and go directly up. The cost is free, all the costs have been covered by our sponsors, but what is very important is that you please bring along your tag so that we know that you are allowed to be inside. And there'll be performances. I've been told to emphasize that there'll be wine and there'll be good food. So thank you very much, and enjoy your well-deserved coffee break.
Well done, well
Thank
done.
you, This is a wonderful job.
About 15 minutes coffee break. Start again around 5.
Oh, sorry, I was joking